Margrethe Vestager is one of the true heroes of international liberal democracy. And here's one reason. In 2014, when she was named head of DG Comp, she inherited a 4-year-old investigation to Google. And there was every reason to believe, to expect that her team would settle. In 2013, in the FTC in the United States, John Leibowitz had dropped a very similar case, declaring there was just no antitrust problem with Google. Meanwhile, Margrethe Vestager's predecessor at DG Comp had already moved to settle with Google 3 times. Once in power, Commissioner Vestager did not settle. Instead, she moved swiftly to bring formal charges, leading within 2 years to the world's first big antitrust victory over Google, an inspiration to people around the world. And here's another reason why Margrethe Vestager is a hero of liberal democracy, international liberal democracy. Last year, our group, Open Markets, we hosted a conference in Washington about disinformation and interference by big tech. And in the preparation conversation with then Vice President Vestager, I asked the Vice President to remind people what anti-monopoly is all about. In that speech, this is in June of 2024, in that speech, as a sitting Vice President of the European Commission, Margrethe Vestager went back to the origins of anti-monopoly of the European Union in the 1940s. And she said the purpose of anti-monopoly is to stop fascism. That's the purpose of anti-monopoly. That's what's in your laws. That's what's in your founding documents. And then the kicker, the sitting Vice President of the European Commission then said, sadly, once again today, we face a threat of totalitarianism. Again, the first, again, fearless, again, a true leader of international liberal democracy. Please join me in welcoming Margrethe Vestager.
Well, that was kind. So, what can be added? Well, we should split up now and get the things going. You just heard the panel. There are things to do. But just to take you back a bit as to why all of this is important, because it will only work if we engage people. This is not for the few. The fight for democracy is for the many. That's the very point. And the foundation is the respect of the integrity of the individual, of each and every one of us. It's from this that we can have peace, democracy, a social market economy that gives everybody a fair chance of making it. Not a guarantee, but a fair chance of making it. To start a business, get a job, buy a home, educate their children, live in a healthy environment. This is the promise. This is what we're thriving for. The reality that we live in is war, climate crisis, dysfunctional governments, erosion of trust in our institutions and in our leaders. So the progress towards a society with all these benefits for each and every one of us, at best it's stalled, more likely it's reversed. Ask any woman who follows other women's issue around the planet. You'd see the reverse. And the thing is that things are accelerating. The world was not too good before. Before Trump, it was not too good before. The UN didn't work. The WTO didn't work. There were so many things that weren't working, but yet we had a stable disorder. And that made us think that we had time to talk and to think and to move slowly. Now we have an accelerating unpredictable, unstable disorder. So the good news is that when everything is up in the air, it's not a given that it falls down badly. That depends on us. And that is the urgency, to show that we believe in the future and that we want to shape that future, that we see a better future ahead of us. It's not just about preventing totalitarianism or whatever that word is. It's about figuring out what we hope for, what we work for, what it is that we want. Because otherwise we'll not be able to address the climate crisis. We'll not be able to not only preserve but also develop our democratic systems, to create trust where it's missing and to preserve it where it still thrives. Of course, the digital future is here. It's driven by AI. All of that technology exists. So it's not about the technology. It's about how all of that is being used. And the problem that we are faced with is a problem of concentration, because concentration threatens democracy in itself. As said, it's not the digitization, it's not the technology. It is concentrated platforms, dominant intermediaries, unchecked AI. That is a substantial part of the problem. Because the thing is that with market power, you get political power. When a handful of companies control how we communicate, what information we see, which businesses can reach their customers, well, then they shape democracy itself. And this was the original fear that was addressed with competition law, that concentrated market power poses an inherent threat to democracy. And I think that concern has rarely been more acute than today. So unchecked dominance, it's not just a question of harming consumers or competitors. It undermines democratic institutions. When platforms can amplify or suppress information, when they can make or break businesses with algorithmic decisions, when their lobbying power exceeds that of most governments, of course our democracy becomes fragile. And that, of course, makes competition policy a democratic tool. Yeah, it's also good to keep prices low, quality high, to drive innovation, obviously. But it's more than that. It keeps market contestable. It prevents abuse of power. It preserves plurality. And those are core descriptions of what is a democratic society. So some suggestions. First, enforce existing laws. There will be no digital sovereignty without enforcing the laws that we have already, full stop. Then it's just a talking point. So GDPR, as it was just said, a lot of issues can be solved with preserving privacy. The rights that are in there, well, they will solve a lot of things. And without it, surveillance becomes the default, and with that, the individual autonomy. So copyright, it's such an old concept that if you produce something, you own the rights to it. It's not strange. It's not radical in any way. And yet it becomes quite radical, because enforcing competition law is a way to make sure that we will have a future of writers, of singers, of filmmakers, of journalists, all those creative sectors that are now under massive attack. AI cannot be allowed to hollow out the funding for fact-check journalism or creative work. And the copyright laws, well, they are there to be used. Third, the DMA, open and contestable market. Interoperability, data access, restraints on self-preferencing, untying. This is not radical. This is the bare minimum to make a market work. Everybody should ask for this because it gives people a fair chance of making it based on their ideas, their work ethic, the people they have on board. It's not for the gatekeepers to decide whether you should be successful or not. The DSA, of course, we cannot be the collateral damage of Section 230, which is the situation right now. And DSA is also a very simple thing. It's a transparency infrastructure as to what is taken down so that you can complain about it if you disagree. It's also the only way to make sure that national laws are upheld. As you will know, we don't have European laws on content. These are national laws. It's a reasonable thing to ask that those laws are being upheld. It's not radical. And it's also, I think, quite simple to ask for products being safe to use. Also digital products, that they do not undermine democracy, that they're not a risk to our mental health. These are basic things. We have been following this all through the history of the European Union, all through the history of member states, having made sure that products should be safe to use. We'll never accept endocrine disruptors in a feeding bottle, and yet you give the baby an iPad. The AI Act, safety when AI is deployed, no embedded discrimination, transparency about how systems work when they are part of making decisions about our lives. Can you get an insurance? Can you get a mortgage? Can you get into a university or another educational institution? Simple stuff. Very old and definitely not radical. And then, of course, competition law. Bring cases, assess mergers. You know, these are laws, they need interpretation. When we find something that we do not immediately understand, reinterpret the laws. Tell everybody how you're going to do it, and then enforce it equally towards each and every one. You know, 10 years ago, we didn't think about harm to innovation. Now, harm to innovation, we see that and we look for that, the new colleagues, in each and every merger case. So that is first things first, enforce the laws and put your resources to do it. Second, provide alternatives. I listened to that Eurostack, important, sure. How many people understand what that is? Very few. We already have European cloud. We already have European social platforms. We already have European word processing products. We have it all. It's just to get out there and to use it as it was suggested. Make switching possible, make it visible, make it viable. Show that we have choice. We need to organize the big shift day. Because of course you don't want to be the only one to go somewhere unprecedented. No, you want to go as a crowd. Because that's the only difficult thing. It's not difficult to build new digital products. A lot of that is commoditized. There's a lot of funding flowing around. The real difficulty is the network effect. And this is why we're here. Because this is part of the network effect. And that can make us change. Third, have a life that is not digital. Well, have a life. First things first. Have a life of football, of scouts, of community work, of face-to-face connections. Don't let AI come for our relations, because that is a real threat. You know, digitization came for the contact points. AI may come from all our relations. The physical world, unmediated relationships, that matter. It's important for the kids. It's important for us as well. You know, the brain works much better with other people than with the screen. Fourth, build AI guardrails. Yes, we have some in Europe. We have the Hiroshima process of the G7. But we need, of course, much more, and we need to keep pushing. As long as AI is unguided and unguarded, we're in trouble. And fifth, know what is the race that we're in. We're being told this constantly. We're in a race. The US and China, they're ahead. Well, what is it, a 400-meter or a marathon, or what is it? You know, this is not a race for us to become China. I think we would be very poor Chinese. We're not in a race to adopt unregulated platform capitalism either. We're in a race to continue developing socially inclusive societies where people like to live. This is the race that we're in. And that is encouraging. That is something that can make you sign up, because it's not complicated. Because that is what we have been trying to do for decade after decade after decade, to make these societies worthwhile. Because you have freedom, because you have choice, because you have a fair chance of making it, buying a home, see your children well off. My suspicion is that that is not the race for the US or China. It's just a hypothesis. But I think it's the dream of almost everybody to live in such a society. And that is where strength comes from. And this is why we are strong. So the question is not, can we keep up with technology? The question is, can we shape technology to serve that dream, or will we allow it to undermine it? So let me just finalize where I started. That competition equals opportunities. It lowers barriers to entry. It favors plurality. It democratizes the relationship between individuals and the business community. And it touches on our most fundamental values: individual freedom, fairness, to compete on the merits and not on the power that you hold. And it's especially critical in the markets between knowledge and government, the news media, information platforms, the threats to independent journalism that we're faced with today, the eradication of local news. The platforms and AI, they're not neutral. They're concentrating power, extracting wealth, reshaping how we think, how we communicate, how we govern ourselves. So this is the time to show that we're the guardians. Obviously, this will not be solved by competition alone. I think that is an absolute given. But it can play a role once we do all the other things at the same time. But we cannot do it without competition. Because if we do it without competition, then we'll just have another set of concentrated powers that will do exactly the same thing as those we know today. So this is what we need. And of course, we need to do that with US friends. We need to work together with those who want to and can. And the Brazil example is amazing. We're not against anyone in Europe, but I think the point is that we need to do what we can to preserve the freedom to compete, the plurality of voices, the contestability of markets, because in that, we built democracy. And all of that comes from the respect of the integrity of each and every one of us. That's the race we're in, and that is one worth winning. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. That was fantastic. And, you know, one of the things I wanted to unpack, and, you're seen as, you were the head of DG Comp for a long time, actually, in European
You see
history.
it, I'm
Yeah.
afraid.
So the, uh, in competition, you ended with a statement about competition, which was actually very powerful. But during the course of your conversation, you spoke about the Eurostack, and you spoke about journalism and advertising, and you spoke about copyright, and you spoke about enforcement of competition laws. So actually, can you just there's a I think a lot of people, when they hear the word antitrust or when they hear the word anti-monopoly, they don't really understand just how broad, how fundamental these laws are. That this is, so you know this is really a way of shaping our lives. I mean, and just can you sort of maybe sort of talk a little bit about just the power of competition policy as a way of running a political economy?
So when I started in GD Comp more than 10 years ago, they had just made a small video about the environment around the Tower Madou, where their offices are. And part of that video showed them coming into a bakery, and they asked the woman behind the counter, "So do you have any competition?" And she says, "No, thanks God, we don't." Because the thing is, for some, competition is heavily felt. And the benefits, they are so thinly spread on each and every one of us that we don't think about it on a daily basis. And that can lead, I think, to a very dangerous misunderstanding that it's not important. But the thing is that if there is no one to challenge those who hold power, then we're done. And this I think people do understand, because a lot of the feedback that I get is that people are very happy with big tech having done something illegal, and you want to say they did something illegal. I think the first ever press release I was presented with said something, this company have behaved in breach of section yada yada, something yada yada, another yada yada. I said, no, this company has done something illegal. That is what we're going to say, because that is the case. And the fines, we can discuss whether they work, because a lot of behavior do not change or come back in different shapes and forms. But the fines, they tell a story that you're willing to hold power responsible. And that people understand, because that is one of the fundamental histories that we tell. This is also the story that was told here, that we want to stand up to the bully. We want to see through the bullying tactics, and we want to do something about it. That is the most fundamental story, and that is also a story about competition law enforcement.
And actually, on that issue of holding companies accountable, corporations accountable, there's a big action recently by DG Comp on ad tech, and there was a deadline that was built into that decision. There was both a fine and there was the deadline, and how, I mean, if you were, I know that you don't want to sort of put pressure on your successor, but when you're looking, now that you set a deadline, what would be a next step?
But since you know that, why do you ask me?
So
No, I think
it's better when it's in your words.
yeah,
Actually.
but
So,
no, it's always difficult, and it has happened so many times also with my cases, that there was a deadline and then the companies came back and said, oh, so difficult, we cannot make it.
yeah.
And then you gave them a bit more time, and then it turns out that once you've been reasonable and given more time, and then you put the screws on in the end, it turns out possible. Surprise, but it was possible with the sufficient time. What I think is important about the AdTech case is that it's a really good illustration of inherent conflict of interest, because it's a case about Google owning the marketplace for buying and selling advertising space, owning the one who sells advertising space on that marketplace, and also owning those who buy advertising space on that marketplace. And I think that is the original thing, that we allowed inherent conflict of interest to be a thing in the market. Because that is the same thing when you see Amazon selling Amazon products on the Amazon marketplace. Because we had a case on that, because it turned out that they use all the others, so we think, as a live, consumer investigation, what will sell and what prices, which enable them to take the lion's shares of the profits without having the lion's shares of the products. So we have seen that so many times, that inherent conflict of interest. Had we taken a decision 25 years ago to say that is not going to happen, then the world would have been different. And this we should think about today, because this will be worse with AI. So much worse.
You at one point today, you said this is what we're doing is not radical. It's common sense. You said that, you use the word not radical, 2 or 3 times. And those of us who've been doing competition policy, people call us radicals. And I personally always say, what we're actually being radical to conserve the foundations of our democracy. So when you're conserving the foundations of democracy and human liberty, radicalness is, if we have to uproot power, then we'll uproot power. But, can you just actually even maybe broaden this, understanding for people that what we're doing is not radical, that this is actually fundamental. This is what we've been doing since the 1940s in Europe.
But it's because I have an issue with the word, because I'm a social liberal, and in Danish, my party is called the radical left. As you can hear, consumer people should look at this, because, the name of the package is not what is inside. And it's more than 120 years old, this party, and the name radical was put in front because they were expelled from the rest of the Liberal Party. So they say, okay, then we will be the radicals one, because we will go to the root causes of the issues. That was what it meant. We want to be the liberals that goes to the root causes of these problems in order to solve them structurally and not just gloss over them. And that's a wonderful meaning of the word. And that's a wonderful endeavor and mission. The problem is that it's used as a swear word. It's used as if you're asking for something crazy. And what we need right now is for people to come on board, to see that the laws, they may look technical, but they're asking for something simple. They're just asking for you having a fair chance, and for the products that you use to be safe to use, and for you to be protected as who you are. That should not be labeled as going to the root cause of the problems. That should be labeled as something that we should all enjoy every day of our life.
We talked about this earlier, but, back when Mario Monti was the head of DG Comp, the Bush administration put enormous amount of pressure on Commissioner Monti not to enforce the law. In your early years, you were dealing with the Obama administration. The Obama administration put enormous pressure on Europe not to enforce the laws. We now have another president who's putting enormous pressure on the European Commission not to enforce the laws. As we talked about before, in 2014, you said, well, Google, yeah, let's enforce the law. So, if you were sending a message to President von der Leyen or Mr. Merz, is there, you have pressure and then you have the law and you have some democracy somewhere in between. So how important is it to enforce the law in a difficult time?
Yeah, but enforcing the law is keeping the promises that politicians gave. Alex was just here, Andreas, all of them. Also the Commission. These laws are promises to Europeans that markets will be contestable, that services will be safe, both for you personally, but also for our democracy. These are promises given. And in enforcing the laws, you show that in a democracy, what you promise to the voters is your first priority. And the paradox here is that, the majority of Americans, they agree. They're deeply suspicious of what big tech delivers. Deeply suspicious, because they see the effects on their kids. They see the effect on their attention span, just as the rest of us. They see the effect on their society. And this is why, when you live in a democracy, it's really important to show that your first priority is to keep the promises that were given. And that should also be the priorities in the US democracy. And of course, there's pressure, fair enough. But this is not about US companies. This is about market power and the misuse of market power, no matter where you're headquartered.
Last question. You talked about a lot about the making a better future, and there's a problem with the language, we deal with antitrust, or we've changed it to anti-monopoly, but it's you're anti concentration of power, you're anti a particular company, you're anti a particular behavior, but sort of making, and I think a lot of people in our space fall into this trap of being anti and thinking that's sufficient. I'm against that. But I was really taken by your statement about, what we are doing here is we are envisioning a better future. We are envisioning the world that we want to live in. And these are the tools that we use to build that world, the political tools that we use to build the better world.
But as they sing, don't stop thinking about tomorrow. It's going to be a beautiful place. And it's so much more engaging to build something constructively. Maybe you have to be against something on the way, but it's so much more engaging to say, this is where we want to go. This is what I want my children to enjoy. This is what I want my grandchildren to enjoy. Here in Europe, we put a gigantic loan in the name of the next generation, so better use the money wisely. So I think it's really important to have that. This is why we do it. And it's a good thing. And I think it's Disney who says this, that if the good had not won yet, it's because that we're not at the end.